Imagine you are 15 years old. It is 1780 in the backcountry of South Carolina, and the war has come to your front porch. You live in a house where Loyalists and Patriots sit at the same dinner table and pretend not to notice the tension. Your father keeps his real politics carefully hidden. Your brothers have run to the hills to fight for independence, moving from camp to camp so nobody can find them sleeping. And you, the girl nobody suspects, sit quietly in the corner pouring tea while grown men with muskets talk about who they are going to burn out next. Nobody in that room thinks the teenager refilling their cups is a threat. That single assumption is about to become the worst miscalculation the Loyalist militia of the South Carolina frontier will ever make. How does a 15-year-old girl with no weapon of her own, no horse, no rank, and no protection beyond her own nerve spend well over a year running circles around some of the most feared irregular forces loyal to the British Crown in the American South? How does she do it not once, not twice, but again and again, until the very men hunting her Patriot brothers start to suspect there is a spy sitting inside their own community and never once look in the right direction? Her name was Laodicea Langston. Everyone called her Dicey. There is no statue of her in any textbook you were handed in school. There is no chapter devoted to her next to the chapters on Washington crossing the Delaware or the winter at Valley Forge. For nearly 200 years, her name survived mostly in local memory, in the Carolina upcountry where people still tell the story of the girl and the river, long after most of the official histories of the Revolution had moved on to generals and treaties. That gap between what actually happened and what got written down is exactly where this story lives. To understand what she pulled off, you have to understand exactly where she was standing. The Carolina backcountry in 1780 was not a place of uniforms and formal battle lines and gentlemanly rules of war. It was a place where neighbor turned on neighbor, where a man's political loyalty could get his family burned out of the only home they had by people who had eaten at his table a year earlier. This was partisan war, ugly and intimate, fought farmhouse by farmhouse, barn by barn, with no clear front and no safe rear. And in that kind of war, information was the deadliest weapon either side possessed. Whoever knew where the enemy was sleeping, where the powder was hidden, which trail led to which hideout, usually decided who lived through the week. Dicey's father, Solomon Langston, lived on that knife's edge every single day. He was, by most accounts, sympathetic to the Patriot cause in his heart, but he was surrounded on all sides by Loyalist neighbors and even relatives, men who had thrown their support behind the crown and were now organizing into militia bands willing to enforce that loyalty with fire and rope. Dicey's older brothers had already made their choice months earlier. They had joined the Patriot militia and taken to the hills, never sleeping in the same place twice, because Loyalist patrols in the area were actively hunting men exactly like them. That left Dicey at home, in a house that Loyalist officers treated as neutral, even friendly ground. And home, for a spy, is the single best cover a war can offer. She was young. She was a girl. In 1780, in that world, those two facts added up to something very specific in the minds of the men around her. Invisible. Loyalist officers and Tory neighbors would sit in the Langston house for hours, planning raids over supper, discussing troop movements, naming Patriots to be hunted down and made an example of. And they did all of it in front of Dicey without a flicker of concern. Why would anyone bother hiding operational secrets from a teenage girl clearing plates? She was furniture to them. She was background noise, part of the room, not part of the war. That assumption was the plan's fatal flaw, and Dicey Langston built her entire campaign around exploiting it, night after night, for longer than any of them ever realized. It helps to understand just how strange and merciless this particular corner of the Revolutionary War really was. The 96th district, where the Langston family lived, sat at the center of what historians now describe almost as a civil war within the larger war. A region where the collapse of any real central authority left ordinary families to enforce their own version of justice on their neighbors. There was no single front line to defend or attack here. No army marching in formation between two flags. There were dozens of small, mobile militia bands, Patriot and Loyalist alike, moving through the same hills, sometimes passing within a mile of each other without either side knowing it. Reputation and rumor moved faster than any official dispatch. A family's survival could depend entirely on who happened to be listening at the right supper table on the right night. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of chaotic, information-starved environment where a single reliable source inside the right household could tip the balance of an entire local campaign, and nobody on the Loyalist side ever imagined that source was a 15-year-old girl serving their meals. She listened. She absorbed names, dates, the direction men rode out at dawn, which farms were marked to be burned, which Patriot hideouts had been discovered by Loyalist scouts. She learned to keep her face still while her mind catalogued every detail, learned exactly which expressions kept her invisible and which ones might have given her away, a discipline most trained soldiers would have struggled to maintain under the same nightly pressure. And then, once the house went quiet and the men had ridden off to sleep elsewhere, she found a way, again and again, to get that information to her brothers before the Loyalists could act on any of it, slipping out under cover of darkness, using trails only someone who had grown up in that country would ever think to take, always alone, always without anyone at home realizing she had left and returned before morning. Think about the discipline that required, night after night, for over a year. This was not a single burst of adrenaline. It was a sustained, patient operation run by someone barely old enough to be considered an adult, someone who had to calculate every single evening exactly how much she could risk without blowing apart the fragile trust that let her stay in that room in the first place. One wrong reaction, one visible flinch at the wrong name mentioned over supper, and the entire operation could have collapsed instantly, taking her father and brothers down with it. This was never safe work, not for a single night of it. This was not the kind of thing you could do once and walk away clean. The roads through the Carolina backcountry after dark belonged to armed men who did not ask questions before they fired, and to worse things besides, in the deep woods where a lost traveler could simply vanish. Rivers ran high and cold with autumn and spring rain, and if Dicey was ever caught carrying intelligence to Patriot fighters, there was no courtroom waiting for her, no trial by her peers. There was a rope or a musket ball in the dark, and nobody in that country would have blinked at either fate for a spy, teenage girl or not. The threat was not theoretical. Loyalist militias in the backcountry executed suspected informants with almost no ceremony at all. She did it anyway, over and over for more than a year. The Loyalists in her neighborhood were not fools, and eventually a pattern too obvious to ignore began to take shape. Every time they planned a raid with care and secrecy, the Patriots they were hunting somehow already knew it was coming. Camps that should have been caught by surprise sat empty when the militia arrived. Ambushes that should have worked fell apart before the trap could close. Someone, somewhere was talking, and slowly, inevitably, suspicion began to circle back toward the Langston household. They confronted Solomon Langston directly. They accused him, and by extension his daughter, of feeding information to the rebels operating in the hills. They made the threat explicit. If the leaks did not stop, he would be held personally responsible. And in that stretch of the war, being held responsible could mean losing his farm, his freedom, or his life. Dicey loved her father fiercely. When the danger landed squarely on him because of what she had been doing, she made him a promise. She would stop. She kept that promise for a while, out of love, out of fear, out of the simple exhaustion of living every day inside a war she was fighting with nothing but her ears and her nerve. And then she heard something she could not sit on, no matter what she had promised. Word reached her that a Loyalist militia known across the region for its brutality, a band operating under the command of a man remembered by history simply as Bloody Bill Cunningham, was planning to strike at dawn against a small Patriot settlement called Little Eden. Her own brother was there. So were the families who had staked everything they owned on the Patriot cause, sleeping that night with no idea that a militia with no interest in taking prisoners was already moving toward them in the dark. Dicey Langston had a choice, and it was not an easy one. Keep the promise to her father, stay home, stay safe, Stay quiet and let the morning come however it was going to come. Or break that promise completely and risk everything she had to save people who had no idea death was riding toward them under cover of night. She chose to move. There was no time to wait for daylight, no time to find an escort, no horse fast enough or quiet enough to take without waking the household and drawing exactly the kind of attention that would end her career as a spy on the spot. So Dicey did the only thing left to her. She went on foot, alone, at night, through terrain that grown men twice her size would have thought twice about crossing even in daylight. The distance was roughly 5 miles between her home and the settlement at Little Eden. 5 miles does not sound like much until you are walking it in pitch darkness, through backcountry woods thick with undergrowth that tears at your ankles and hides the kind of armed men who would end your mission, and possibly your life, without a second thought. Every snapped branch in those woods could have been a patrol. Every shift in shadow could have been the end of the story before it ever reached the river she still had to cross. And then there was the river. The Tyger River, swollen with recent rain, cut directly across her path, and there was no way around it. In dry weather, in daylight, it would have been a manageable crossing for anyone with steady footing. That night, after days of rain, it was something else entirely. The current was fast and unpredictable. The water was cold enough to steal the breath straight out of your chest on contact, and the footing on the riverbed was completely invisible beneath the churn of brown water rushing past in the dark. There was no bridge waiting for a 15-year-old girl running an intelligence mission through hostile territory in the middle of the night. There was only the river and a choice: cross it or turn back and let Little Eden face the morning unwarned. She crossed it. Picture the moment fully. A girl, alone, soaked instantly to the skin the second she steps off the bank, immediately fighting a current that wants to take her feet out from under her and carry her downstream into water she cannot see the bottom of. One wrong step on a slick, hidden rock. One moment of panic as the cold locks up her muscles, and the war simply ends for Dicey Langston in a Carolina river that nobody upstream would even hear about until the body was found, if it ever was. She does not turn back. She does not call out for help that is not coming, because there is no one close enough to hear her over the rush of water, even if she screamed. She puts one foot in front of the other, fighting gravity, current, and the plain animal fear of drowning alone in the dark. And she comes out the other side, half frozen, exhausted, her clothes heavy with river water, and still moving toward her brother's camp. Before we reach what happened when she got there, it is worth understanding just how far outside the normal rules of war Dicey Langston was already operating, because the river crossing was not the only time she stared down armed men and refused to back off. On another occasion, a Loyalist soldier arrived at the Langston home determined to confiscate the family's weapons, a common tactic used to strip suspected Patriot households of any means of defending themselves or supplying the militia in the hills. Firearms in that period were not just tools, they were survival itself, for hunting, for protection, for the war being fought a few ridgelines away. When the soldier moved to take the family's gun, accounts describe Dicey refusing to simply hand it over. She is said to have seized the weapon herself and dared the man to try to take it from her by force, daring him to put his name to the act in front of witnesses, rather than simply walk off with it unchallenged. It was a small confrontation compared to what came later, but it tells you everything about the kind of nerve this girl carried into every single one of her encounters with the men who controlled the region around her. She was not simply passing along information quietly from the shadows. She was, when it came down to it, willing to stand her ground directly in front of armed men and refused to be intimidated, at an age when most people twice her years would have simply complied and hoped for the best. That nerve is exactly what carried her across the Tyger River that night, and it is exactly what makes the story of Little Eden land the way it does. This was not a girl improvising bravery for the first time under pressure. This was a girl who had already proven repeatedly in smaller confrontations that most people would have quietly avoided, that she was willing to take the risk when the alternative was letting harm come to people she loved. The river was simply the largest stage she had yet been handed for a kind of courage she had been quietly rehearsing for over a year. She reached her brother before the Loyalist militia reached Little Eden. The warning she carried changed everything that was about to happen at dawn. Instead of a sleeping settlement caught helpless and unarmed, the Patriots at Little Eden had time. Time to arm themselves and prepare a defense, or by some accounts, time to simply evacuate before Bloody Bill Cunningham's men arrived to find nothing waiting for them but empty cabins and cold hearths where they had expected an easy massacre of sleeping families. Think carefully about what that means in practical terms. A raid planned for maximum surprise against people who by every reasonable expectation should have had no warning at all, arrived instead to find the entire element of surprise had already been stolen from them by a 15-year-old girl who had crossed a flooded river on foot, alone, in the dark, to make absolutely sure of it. Every man, woman, and child who would have been killed in their sleep that morning owed their life to a walk. Nobody watching her that evening would ever have believed she could survive. There was no reinforcement column coming to save Little Eden. There was no cavalry riding to the rescue at dawn. There was only one girl, soaked to the bone, arriving just in time, and an entire settlement that got to wake up the next morning because of it. This is the part of the story that gets remembered, the single dramatic night, the river, the desperate race against dawn. But it was never an isolated act of heroism from a girl who had done nothing like it before. It was simply the visible tip of something far larger and far more sustained. Dicey Langston had already spent more than a year running an informal intelligence pipeline out of her own family's home, feeding her brothers and their allies a steady, quiet stream of exactly what she overheard from men who never once imagined the girl at their table was working directly against them. The river crossing was simply the single night when the stakes became too high to hide, the night history finally decided to write her name down. The Loyalist forces hunting the Langston family never caught her doing any of it. They suspected. They threatened her father more than once. They watched the house as closely as they could. And still, again and again, information kept leaking out at exactly the wrong moments for them. Ambushes kept quietly failing, and Patriot fighters across that stretch of the Carolina backcountry kept walking straight out of traps that should have caught them cold. For the officers running that Loyalist militia, confident in their local dominance and loyal to the crown, it must have felt at times like fighting an enemy who could somehow read their minds before they finished forming a plan. They never solved the puzzle. They never found their spy, because they were looking for a soldier, a defector, a man with something obvious to gain. They were never, not once, going to suspect the quiet girl pouring their tea and clearing their plates. Zoom out from that single river crossing, and the larger significance of what Dicey Langston did becomes even clearer. The war in the Carolina backcountry in 1780 and 1781 was not being decided by grand set-piece battles alone, the kind with named commanders and marked lines on a map. It was being decided in dozens of small, brutal, unglamorous engagements, just like the one narrowly avoided at Little Eden, where a warning delivered in time meant the difference between a Patriot militia surviving to fight another season and a Patriot militia being wiped out in its sleep, erased from the war entirely before it could contribute anything more to the cause. Every single time, intelligence like Dicey's made it through in time. It kept the fragile Patriot resistance in the backcountry alive just a little longer, kept the scattered network of hidden camps and constantly moving fighters one crucial step ahead of forces that badly wanted them hunted down and finished. In a grinding war of attrition fought farm by farm and family by family, survival itself was a form of victory, and Dicey Langston handed that survival to her brothers and their allies more than once, quietly, from inside a house full of men who trusted her precisely because they never thought to question her at all. Consider what was actually happening across South Carolina during these same months. The British had captured Charleston in the spring of 1780 and believed for a time that the southern colonies were effectively pacified. What they had not accounted for was exactly this kind of grinding, decentralized resistance in the backcountry, small Patriot bands that refused to disappear no matter how many times Loyalist militias tried to hunt them down. Historians looking back at the Southern Campaign often point to this stretch of the war as the moment the British strategy in the South began quietly unraveling. Not through a single dramatic defeat, but through the accumulated weight of hundreds of failed raids, missed ambushes, and Patriot units that simply would not stay caught. Every single time a girl like Dicey Langston kept a settlement like Little Eden from being wiped out overnight, she was adding one more small grain of sand to a strategic failure the British High Command would not fully understand until it was far too late to reverse. None of the generals planning the Southern Campaign from behind their maps would have known her name. None of them needed to. The effect was the same either way. There is another young figure from this same war worth holding up beside her for just a moment, because the pattern is not a coincidence. Sybil Ludington, far to the north in New York, rode through the night at 16 to warn scattered militia companies of an approaching raid, covering far more ground on horseback than Dicey ever covered on foot. Different colony, different year, an entirely different method of warning her people. But the same underlying truth sits at the center of both stories. In a war fought as much through information and timing as through muskets and bayonets, the men actually running that war on both sides kept catastrophically underestimating exactly who was capable of deciding its outcome. Neither of these girls carried a rifle into the history books. They carried a warning, delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right people, and in a war this close and this personal, that turned out to matter every bit as much as a battlefield victory. Dicey Langston survived the war she had fought without ever firing a shot in it. She went on to marry a Patriot soldier named Thomas Springfield, and she lived a long, full life afterward in the region she had once crossed a flooded river to defend, dying in her 70s, decades after the fighting had finally ended. An old woman who had once been the girl nobody in a room full of armed men ever thought to watch closely. Today, if you drive along Tygerville Road outside Travelers Rest, South Carolina, you will find a marker standing where her family's home once stood. And in recent years, the town has gone further still, building a heritage park in her honor, with a life-size statue meant to stand exactly where a 15-year-old girl once decided that a promise to stay safe mattered less than the lives of the people sleeping in the dark, unaware that danger was already riding toward them. If this is the kind of history that pulls at you, the kind buried underneath battle maps and treaty dates, and the names of generals everybody already knows, stories about the people who never wore a uniform but still changed the outcome of a war anyway, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe now, because there are dozens more stories exactly like Dicey's still waiting here. Ordinary people who did something extraordinary and were very nearly written out of the record entirely. Stand at that marker on Tygerville Road today, and it is easy to forget how quiet this kind of story usually stays. There is no cannon there, no cavalry charge carved into stone, nothing that looks like the war most people picture when they think of the American Revolution. Just a river a short walk away, still running the same course it ran that night. Indifferent to the fact that a 15-year-old girl once nearly died crossing it to save people she had never even met among the families of Little Eden. That is, in many ways, the entire problem with how history chooses to remember its wars. It remembers the generals and the battles with names, and it quietly lets the river crossings disappear into the footnotes, even when the river crossing is the reason people were alive the next morning to fight in the named battles at all. What Dicey Langston did was never a single act of courage that ended when the river did. It was a sustained campaign, conducted from deep inside enemy territory, using nothing but patience, memory, and raw nerve against men who held every material advantage over her and never once, in more than a year, considered her a threat worth watching. That, in the end, is the real story here. Not one dramatic river crossing on one desperate night, but a 15-year-old girl who spent well over a year making fools of an enemy that never thought to look twice at the person quietly serving them dinner. So if this story pulled you in the way it should have, there are more like it, waiting for you right here, every week. The overlooked names, the ones history almost lets slip through the cracks entirely. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments which overlooked figure from this war you think deserves the next deep dive. Dicey Langston crossed a flooded river in the dark and quietly changed the outcome of a war most people only remember for its battles. Somewhere out there is another name just as forgotten, just as deserving, still waiting for its turn to be told.